Okay. This book and this session is coming at a really useful and important time. I mean, last week we just finished one set of elections. We are clearly moving to another big set of elections in 2019. Like, elections are all around us. Everybody's talking about it. All the newspapers are full of it. But of course, in a sense, in India, we are so used to elections. There's always some big election happening all the time that after a point, I think we tend to take India's electoral process for granted. I mean, not the outcomes of the election, but the sheer electoral process. And yes, we hear everyone say, yes, in, world's largest democracy, et cetera, but, we hear it so often, we've become used to it. Ornit's book, which I think is one of the most amazing and surprising books that has come out in nonfiction this year, is a book that tells us why we should not take any of this for granted. She's uncovered this history, which, I think so many historians have just hit themselves on the head and said, oh my God, this history was here and how come nobody has told it before? Which tells us why we shouldn't take India's electoral process for granted. And I'll get to explaining what exactly she's done in this book, but let's take one step back and start with something, the most basic thing we don't even think about, which is universal franchise. The fact that every man and woman above a certain age has a vote. Now, we think of this we take this for granted, but historically, this has not been the case, right, Ornit?
No, of course not. I mean, when you think about it, in India, the Constituent Assembly decided to adopt universal adult franchise in April 1947, and that was based on a recommendation by the interim report of the Fundamental Rights Committee. So in India, in principle, every woman and man got the right to vote in April 1947. That was not obvious even in a global context. In France, women got the vote in 1946. In Switzerland, in some cantons, women got the vote in 1947. So that was quite revolutionary.
And you said it happened with almost no debate in India.
Exactly. There was, I mean, we have to remember that there was an expectation that universal franchise would be adopted in the Indian Constitution because of the nationalist struggle, the mass movement led by Gandhi, and the Nehru report written by Motilal Nehru, Nehru's father, in 1928, where they deliberated the question of the future franchise. The Nehru report of 1929 is a result of the All India Party's conference and Indians trying to write for themselves a constitution. And they debated the question of franchise, and they thought, can we do it in the face of the high level of illiteracy? And they conclude there that anything that is not universal franchise would be a compromise on democracy. But there is a huge gap to bridge between an idea, a commitment to an idea, like adult suffrage, and the ability to actually implement it under the very difficult conditions of independence.
Right. And so Ornit's book is really about how we made that leap from deciding we would do universal franchise to actually implementing it. Now, the question is, why was it so difficult? Let's go through the challenges. I mean, the obvious ones are illiteracy and so on, but there were many other problems in India at that time. For instance, there wasn't even really in India, right?
Exactly. But just a second before I go to that point, let me just, say something. We've been accustomed to think that the reason there is democracy in India is because it was an inheritance of the British Raj. But we should just remember that while there were elections under colonial rule, these elections were not really democracy. The franchise was given under the 1935 Act to something like 30 million people, those who had the right to vote.
There was a limit of property.
Exactly, property, gender, education.
So the idea of giving a vote to, absolutely every person, whether they were educated or not, whether they had any property or not, was actually really radical.
Exactly. It was totally rewriting the colonial imagination to do that. But going back to the point you were making about how difficult it was. So 85% of the population was illiterate. 50% of that prospective electorate were women who did not even recognize themselves as individuals, but as wife of, daughter of,
Yeah,
etc.
this is a fascinating detail that Ornit, unearths later on in the book, and I'm going to ask you to explain what the problem was here. This is, I think it happened in the United Provinces.
Among other places. So what is happening when they start to enumerate everyone across India? Some district officers write to the governments to say that women refuse to register themselves in their own names. They refuse to give their names, and instead they want to be registered as wife of, daughter of, widow of, etc. And apparently, such a procedure was allowed under colonial elections. But this time, the government of UP in this case is saying, no, you cannot do that. You have to be registered as individuals in your own name. And the government is making efforts and propaganda to get women to be enrolled in their own names, to, in principle, individualize them. So the government of UP publishes press notes saying universal franchise means that each woman and man should have the right to vote. We're anxious that you'll be on the roll. They send propaganda vans to try and explain it to women, register women, and they employ women to try and help with it. Ultimately, before the first elections that took place only in October 1951 to February 1952, 2.8 million women were struck off the rolls because they were not registered in their own name, and that was fixed for the following elections.
Just look at the scale of the problem that implies that, here we were trying to give the vote to people who, because of the systems they were living with, didn't even have a name. I mean, they would have had a name when they were girls, but when they were married, they stopped having a name. They became mother of, wife of, and ultimately widow of. And, and the election commission had to find a way to give them a name. So I think what happened was, by the time of the next election, in 57, the process was complete, and these nameless women had names, at least on the electoral roll.
But it was not only just the conditions of illiteracy we spoke about. Don't forget, this is happening in the midst of partition, the tearing India's territory and its people apart. We have around 18 million refugees across India, and go and make an electoral roll under such conditions. And not only it wasn't clear who is an Indian in the context of partition, because the work on preparing the rolls is happening between November 1947 to just before the enactment of the Constitution in 1950. So this is happening, the preliminary, the preparation of the first draft electoral rolls is taking place ahead of, in anticipation to the Constitution. So, we have partition, we have refugees, and we still have 552 princely states,
yeah, this is the part of India that everyone forgets about, that, even as of independence, I mean, there were all the princely states who were not yet integrated. There was an expectation that they would be integrated, but they were not yet.
So, commonly we think that by 15th August 1947, with partition, the states were integrated through the instrument of accession. But first, many states did not even sign the instrument of accession by 15th August 1947. Secondly, from a constitutional viewpoint, the instrument of accession only entrenched the sovereignty of the ruler, because he only ceded his sovereignty on three subjects: communication, external affairs, and defense. As far as the rest was concerned, he was the sovereign. And in that sense, at the time, some states and some unions of states that were created at the time were busy putting up their own constituent assembly to even write their own constitution. the Constituent Assembly of India had no powers on constituting for the states. And one of the things I'm suggesting in the book is that in that context, when the territory of India was in great flux and where is India was not clear, and there was not yet a federation. In fact, the biggest task for India was to create a federation. The process of enrolling everyone in the provinces, in the state, became a means of actual integration.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's come back to the electoral roll. I mean, to have an election, you need to have an electoral roll. That's like the most basic point. And, you know, this was absolutely an obvious question. Somehow never seems to have occurred to you, to people to ask, how did India come up with its own electoral roll, until Ornit asked the question. I mean, how did that come out?
Yeah, how did I become obsessed with the list? Yeah. So, you know, the story of the book, the reason I wrote this book in the first place, is a result of a question I've been asking of senior election officials in India and didn't get a good answer for. And I asked, how did India prepare the first list of voters? It was in the context of me writing about citizenship, in the context of partition, and thinking how in that context they actually made the list. I knew India's first election were the, you know, greatest experiment in world history, 173 million voters. And I was told to go and read about it in the report on the first elections. And there is a wonderful report, official report on the first elections. And there are 2 pages in this report which mention briefly that in November 1947, the Constituent Assembly of India made some decisions and some preliminary work was done. Literally 3 paragraphs. I went to any possible archive to try and find anything about it. I looked at the constitutional debates, I couldn't find anything about it. And I ultimately really nagged the Election Commission of India to please let me try and see whether these files are there in the record room. And it was very discerning of them to allow the record keeper and me to go and try and find it. A very tidy, neat archive. And it's in the basement of the Election Commission. And at the very, very back of the room, there was a pile of very old files covered in dust. And these were the files. And the files were never looked at. And these were the files of the branch of the Constituent Assembly Secretariat who prepared, these bureaucrats who prepared, managed the preparation of the first draft electoral roll. After I found these files and worked in the Election Commission's record room, I told the director of the National Archives of India, and these files were transferred to the National Archives of India, and anyone can go and
But they could
look
just
at
have
them.
been like discarded or dumped or lost in some fire or to insects or something.
Sorry?
It could easily have been lost. I mean, like...
Well, I'm not sure lost, but it's like it was really, you know, I think the first time that someone really looked carefully into these papers after such a long time, very frail papers.
Your book also answers a question, which again I never thought about, which is why we have an election commission. Because, you know, the election commission is again an institution that we tend to take for granted. It's there, it comes before election, you know, politicians fight with it. You know, it's the status of the appointment of election commissioners is now being questioned in the Supreme Court, but the election commission is just there. But, you know, it's when you look at, you know, what's interesting is you look at countries like the United States, which does not have an election commission, where elections are left to every state, within every state it's left to every county, and as we just saw from the recent elections in the US, there are states like Georgia where the whole process is deeply questioned, where there is no, you know, standard really of of good practices. Actually, American elections are a mess compared to Indian elections. I mean, not that Indian elections are perfect, but at least we have this one body called the Election Commission overseeing it all. And how did this happen?
So it's not just why India has the election commission, but why an election commission that is so strong, independent, autonomous, and it's directly linked to the story I'm telling. And the original article, the original provisions in the draft constitution of 1948 suggested that as far as the management of elections, every state of the union would have its own election commission. And it's in the wake of these 9-10 months of the preparation of the draft rolls that the bureaucrats at the Secretariat of the Constituent Assembly realized that that would be a bad idea. A bad idea because as they were preparing the list, there were many, many attempts at disenfranchisement of people on the ground, attempts at infringement of the instructions. And they realized that unless there is going to be a central and very autonomous election commission, people can be disenfranchised at the whim of a district officer or even someone else.
Basically, what we could have ended up with was a separate Gujarat election commission, a separate Maharashtra election commission, a separate Assam election commission, with each election commission being influenced, as is going to happen, by the local politicians.
So what is happening, the bureaucrats at the Secretariat, they write a note to the drafting committee suggesting this is why there should be a central, autonomous, strong election commission. And this is done by, first they look around, they look, what are the election management bodies across the world? Are they good enough? And they're deeply dismissive about the American one and about the British one. And they ultimately set up, these are the provisions that you have at the moment are the provisions that they draft on the basis of this process. In fact, the joint secretary of the Secretariat, who was one of the people who managed this process, was also, S.N. Mukherjee was the chief draftsman of the Indian Constitution. And when Ambedkar presents to the House the new provisions, he says, this is a revolution, this is radical change, but the reason we're presenting this radical change, now when he explained the reason, he doesn't say this is because what we saw in the preparation of rolls, but when he explains it, the explanation he gives include examples of this kind of disenfranchisement that took place while they were preparing the electoral rolls.
So, to answer the question, we actually got, the main country we got this idea of a central election commission from is Canada. Canada in the 1920s institutes a single electoral officer, I think the name is called, and in the Constituent Assembly, the debates look at the Canadian model and decide that, this is the one big thing India has got from Canada. So what comes through in the book is the role played behind the scenes by a bunch of bureaucrats. And bureaucrats don't have a good reputation. We like, talking about bureaucracy in a bad term. But Ornit's book really is a tribute to a bunch of forgotten bureaucrats. And here I'm going to bring in a personal collection because which educated me on how forgotten this whole history is. Because actually my grandfather was one of these bureaucrats, and I didn't know this. I knew my grandfather as a diplomat, he was an ambassador, and we knew all about his life as an ambassador, and we knew that he had been part of something to do with the Constituent Assembly, etc. But the ambassador part is more glamorous, so that's what we focused on. And then one day, several years back, I got an email from Ornit saying that, I'm investigating the election commission, the electoral history of India, and I found these really interesting notes made by your grandfather. And I was like, what? Who is this? Is Israeli academic telling me something about my grandfather that I don't know about? And this book is a revelation, has been a real revelation to me and my family, because it's uncovered the role that a young bunch of lawyers, including my grandfather, made. Can you just explain how they landed up in this position of extraordinary power and how they responded to it?
So this whole process of the preparation of rolls, and it's not just the management of the preparation of rolls, it was a 4 months of dialogues, deliberations on even devising instructions of how to prepare electoral roll on the basis of universal adult franchise as an all-India project under the conditions we mentioned. So it was a branch of the Secretariat of the Constituent Assembly of India. It was a small interim body guided by the constitutional advisor B.N. Rao. And this branch was really composed of few people. It was the joint secretary I mentioned, S.N. Mukherjee. It was your grandfather, K.V. Padmanabhan. It was two researchers, another undersecretary, and they were, you know, how they were recruited is not so clear. It's clear that your grandfather was brought there. I know the Ministry of External Affairs was headhunting him and wanted him early on, but he was part of that. The interesting thing is that it was this small group that were highly competent people, very, very committed, and very responsive to the people. Because the whole success of this operation was obviously not simply in the hands of competent bureaucrats, people of admirable integrity. Because on the ground, as I already mentioned, of course there were bureaucrats, administrators that were trying to disenfranchise or didn't think that some people should have the right to vote. But people complained when they saw that there are attempts to disenfranchise or infringe on instructions, because this group of bureaucrats, what they did, they made the public aware of what they're doing and of their instructions. They published in all languages the instructions that they were given. They wrote it in a form of a story to make people, you know, to help people to kind of engage with it. And when people complained about such instances, they were very responsive. And responsive to the level that they would also bring to account local administrators that were, you know, misbehaving.
This is one of the most extraordinary parts of the book, because we are talking about a time before actually modern India actually existed. This is pretty much pre-independence, or just in that overlap period, definitely before, while the Constituent Assembly is still debating. And yet you have people, you have Indians, who have a strong sense of themselves as an Indian, of their rights, which technically were not yet rights, writing to this body, saying that our rights as citizens, you know, are not being respected. Please do something. And these bureaucrats are writing back and actually doing something.
Exactly. And can you imagine being a person, an ordinary person in Assam, in a village, and getting a letter from the Secretariat of the Constituent Assembly of India with an emblem symbol of the Constituent Assembly Secretariat? So people had, in effect, almost no degree of separation from the Secretariat of the Constituent Assembly when they wrote and complained, and very quickly received an answer acknowledging the letter, and a little bit later receiving another letter that explained, this is what we did about the problem you complained about. And I think that from the perspective of doing the research, that was one of the most overwhelming experiences for me, to read the letters of people.
Can you give us some
point
examples?
I mean, there's so many of them. It would be almost a sin. I mean,
just one or two, maybe.
Shall I read one?
Yeah.
Or gosh, we didn't. You know, I guess. Will you hold it? Maybe I'll find. You know, I think my copy has marked pages.
Sorry.
Shall I read?
Yeah, please. Just one or two, because the letters are really so moving.
So, you know,
and also, it's quite a contrast. You know, many of the letters actually were from Assam, which was then as now was a contested area. And it's amazing, you know, reading those letters and the fact that they got a response comparing with what is happening in Assam and the National Citizens Register today. But that's another matter.
So, you know, I actually want to read one letter and tell you about another one, because this one letter is a refugee organization. So many refugees wrote to the Secretariat of the Constituent Assembly about questions of disenfranchisement. And the reason was the following, and it goes directly to the comment you made, which is extremely important, of people understanding that a place on the electoral roll is the thing that can really secure a place in the state for them. Because at the time, as I said, who is an Indian was one of the most contested questions. There was no citizenship law, or there was no constitution. There were only citizenship provisions. And in order to be a voter, you needed to be a citizen, And you needed to have a place of residence where you're registering for 180 days. But of course, who is a citizen, as I said, was unclear, especially with regard to refugees. And of course, they didn't have the 180 days residence. So there were special provisions to include them in the most liberal way by their mere declaration that they're committing to stay and reside where they're being registered.
I mean, you get the real sense that the bureaucrats were trying to find solutions.
Yeah.
They were trying to find ways to make sure that everybody featured on the electoral roll. So.
Exactly, and the Reforms Commissioner of Assam initially refuses to register these people, and he said they are not citizens. He sends directives. So one such citizen organization is sending a letter to the Constituent Assembly of, the Secretariat of the Constituent Assembly, and suggests that they think that these commissioners of Assam instruction not to enroll these, he calls them floating population, that not registering them is both legally and constitutionally wrong, and that the cases of people born outside the present Indian territory but long settled in Assam are covered by Article 5b, read with the explanation number 1 of the draft constitution, and as such, they are to be regarded as citizens at the date of the commencement of the constitution. So what is happening? People, right, read the draft constitution. They interpret the draft constitution. They start to use the language of the draft constitution. So you know when Ambedkar says in the Constituent Assembly in November 48, when he presents the revised draft, he says, we're trying to implement a democratic constitution on an undemocratic soil. And indeed the articles in the constitution, so many of them are principles, abstract principles. And through this process, this becomes a convention. But the other side of people writing is about how people begin to think about this new polity of universal franchise and what does it mean for them and how they try to imagine what does it mean and how they make a place for themselves in this new universe of universal franchise. So you have people writing about the question of the age of voters, on caste, and there is a fantastic letter of a person from Pune that writes and say, the age that you set for voters, I think it has no psychological logic behind it. You set 21. I think, he says, it should be 21 for women and 25 for men, because this is considered to be the right age of marriage. And ultimately, there's not much of a difference between choosing a mate and choosing a legislator. So, this I'm almost quoting, but there's dozens of letters of people writing with all kind of inventive, creative ideas, which showed how they really began to imagine their place on the electoral roll, to the extent that some labor union write when, their employers are saying, we're not going to have a holiday on the day you're being enumerated, and they write, if you want, let us cooperate and register us. So then the whole thing is not going to work. It's going to be a waste of your time. So, people start to imagine it. And that's one of the most overwhelming things, realizing how people drove the process, the success of preparing the first roll.
Let's just talk a little bit more about the refugees, because this was clearly the big issue. I mean, you had people flooding in, with matters changing on the ground. How did what was the decision taken on refugees? Okay,
so as I already explained, these basic criteria, being 21, being a citizen and a resident, the refugees didn't meet these two basic criteria of citizenship and residence. And as they start the enumeration, the Secretariat, they start getting letters from bureaucrats across the country saying, how shall we register refugees? They don't have the residence qualification. The Secretariat understands that this is a real problem, and your grandfather writes a note saying they will be enfranchised and it's not going to be their fault. Let's try to find a solution. And they try to find a solution over almost 3 months, not by an off-the-cuff solution. They are instructed to look into international precedents, like what happened after the partitioning of the Ottoman Empire? What happened about refugees in the wake of the beginning of the First World War? And they realized, they write in their reports, that even in places where there was a mass naturalization of people as citizens, this minute question of registering people as elector, they couldn't find anywhere. So they had to find their own procedure. And it's B.N. Rao say, at the moment, these are preliminary roles. There are no reasons why not to enroll all the refugees on the mere declaration that they will reside permanently where they're being registered, and later on, when roles will have to be revised before the election, we can ensure their place on the roll.
And you have to understand how important this was, because the refugees had come to India, leaving, in many cases, everything of their past lives. Many had no property, many had just come with their lives. They'd come with this sort of promise of being a citizen of India.
But you know, it's beyond that. It was so not obvious, because at the same time that the Secretariat of the Constituent Assembly decides to enroll all refugees on the basis of their declaration, without distinction between who is a bad refugee or a good refugee, other apparatus of the state at the time actually make this distinction, right? All these laws about the influx of the returning of refugees and the permit system, etc. So that was not at all obvious even at the context.
I mean, I don't want to force comparisons to what is happening, not just in India, around the world today. But what is this, the immense generosity of this process? Does it have lessons for us in a world today when, where refugees again are moving, where issues of citizenship are really fraught, where this issue of good refugees versus bad refugees, good immigrants versus bad immigrants is being asked across the world?
You know, I think that, I mean, one has to look at what they've done in order to think about today,
right,
because it was the most courageous thing they did at the time with the refugees. But these people saw their task as, they had a bureaucratic, they were very competent, very professional. And the task, when you think about it, their task was to operationalize the principle of procedural equality, to make every man and woman equal voters, to be on the list, have exactly the same weight. They were bureaucratizing procedural equality. That's what they were doing. And they took this work seriously and did anything in their capacity to include everyone. When you read the files were not about what it means to the nation and freedom and democracy. It was about, there was a bigger bureaucratic task, and we have to do this task properly. And if we do want to have democracy, we can't compromise it. The list has to be done properly.
Did they face any opposition?
The opposition was, the opposition in the operation itself was as a result of, ongoing situations of sometimes disenfranchisement because of misunderstanding of the instructions, not always because of any deliberative intentions, etc., but sometimes misunderstanding instructions. Sometimes local governments interpreted their instructions of the Secretariat in a wrong way, etc. So this was an ongoing, they had to oversee what is happening in the provinces and the state to see that things are happening properly, and it's a result of these ongoing interactions that they were able to mentor administrators across the country into it. So there was this opposition. Beyond that, you can say that it was towards the end of the process, when the roles were already, the draft roles were almost ready, that there were some politicians that suddenly raised doubts about, are we really going to give the right to vote to all these illiterate people and put on the same footing the literate and illiterate? But it was far too late in the process at that time.
So there's some good sometimes in keeping politicians out of processes.
In that, that's one of the wonderful things, that the book is a story of bureaucrats and people. There are no politicians in the story.
Okay, on that note, I'm sure there are lots of people, with questions. We have some time for questions. Are there any mics out in the audience? One from the front row, yeah? Yeah, we have time for questions. So can we get a mic, please? Or maybe just take mine.
Yeah, sure. Hi, thanks so much. It's been a lovely discussion. My name's Pranav, and I'm actually a lawyer. So my question is, while campaigning for these elections that happened in 1952, what was the process like? Because there was really no opposition, right? You had Nehru going around.
It's very difficult to hear, huh?
What was the process of campaigning for the elections? Campaigning? I mean, because there was no real opposition, right? And we just had partitions. So how did they actually go about all these things? And right now you have rules as to how much you can spend, how all of this happens. So was it something similar back then?
Well, actually, this book is about what happened before that, because all that Ornit's book is about, it's not actually about the election. I mean, that's another book. Maybe Ornit will write it one day, or someone else will write it. But for that election to happen, you had to have an electoral roll, and this is this book is about that. I mean, I've also written about it, so I can tell you. I mean, yes, there were parties. I mean, the 1952 election is fascinating in its own right, because a whole new range of challenges come up. You have to deal with illiterate voters, so the idea of symbols for parties is first floated, an idea that we actually get from Ceylon, which is where it was first started. The elections were actually more complicated than elections today, because we had multiple member constituencies. So there were constituencies which had two members, sometimes a scheduled caste or scheduled tribe member and a regular member. I think there was one constituency which actually had a regular member, a scheduled caste member, and a scheduled tribe member. So there was actually one 3-member constituency. So voters had to vote for multiple elections. So, and they did. I mean, but that's another fascinating story.
Let me make one comment on your question. In fact, my next project is a history of the first elections, which takes place later. But it's not so simple as there was no opposition. The Congress actually did face opposition for the first elections. So this is important to remember, right? And the campaigning process there were huge campaigns of all parties. So it wasn't as simple as no opposition for the party.
Because, it depends on how many people. Okay, so is there anyone else who wants to ask a question?
Hi. Just wanted to know, the age of voting was 21. And then in 88, it was brought down to 18. Is there any particular reason behind this? Maybe it's beyond the realm of your book, but just curious to know.
I don't know exactly the context of the debates over the reduction of the age of voters from 21 to 18, but internationally, by that time in the 80s, it was 18 in most countries, but until then it was indeed 21.
So how has election commission, while you were researching this book, you were in a way working with the election commission also. So how would you compare the functioning of the election commission right now and the Secretariat of the Constituent Assembly that looked after this process? How would you compare the two?
I think that I'll share with you another thing. So I said that I was asking election officials this question that I didn't get a good answer for. And the context in which I asked this question is because I've been part of a conference that takes place now over the last 17 years. It's a conference of election commissioners and election management bodies from across the Commonwealth. And over these last 17 years, every time I hear election commissioners from Africa, Australia, Canada, India, and it's over 17 years hearing about elections in all these countries and hearing about the ongoing innovations of the Election Commission of India. And I do see continuity in the practices and the kind of institutional integrity that the Secretariat instilled, at least in the following way. I think the Election Commission of India still today is very open to hear from the public, from the media, from civil society. It's a very dynamic institution, right? And that is the thing that also came out in the process of preparing the role. The realization that, you know, at the time it wasn't political parties, it was attempts to disenfranchise on the ground, right? Why would someone register Dalits in a village, right? I mean, so this idea wasn't at all obvious to people. Today it's about innovations around attempts of political parties to do this or that. So I think the institutional practice and integrity of, for example, the Elections Commission ability to second administrators from across the country and make sure that they have people that they choose to run elections, etc. I do think that this responsiveness, accountability, and the need to be with the hand on the pulse, right, is something that was instilled at the time.
And you know, I think one thing you really learn from this book, as I said, is to value the fundamentals of the Indian electoral process, which, as I said, is something we tend to take for granted. And that is a big danger, because if we take it for granted, we will not be able to defend it. We need to compare, really, the election process in India with other countries, like I said, the United States, because you see, politicians of all parties attack the Election Commission because that's what politicians do. I mean, and the Election Commission tries to defend itself, and we tend to get influenced by political parties of all kinds. But I think what you really get from this book is an appreciation for the processes of the Indian election, which we really need to have, because as I said, if we don't value these processes, we can lose them.
And you know, I just want to add one more thing. You know, having an electoral democracy doesn't secure democracy. Doesn't mean that you have democracy, that you have equality and, you know, the whole ideas of implementation of the will of the people, etc. It doesn't at all secure democracy. But without a robust democracy, you don't have a chance to get there. Because the one thing that a robust electoral democracy provides, it provides the institutional basis for the generation and regeneration of political hope. It provides for you, people, voters, to choose a better government next time. And you know, you saw it only 2-3 days ago when the election results came out. Doesn't matter where your political leanings, the fact is that people can make choices and change their choices, and that means that governments have to be accountable to people. And to have an strong institutional basis for regenerating and generating political hope is not something to take for granted either.
Yeah, so we'll go for the last question for this session. Thank you.
Hi, this is Kuntal. You answered my first question. My second question was, have you done like a comparative study of other election bodies around the world, and are you planning to do a project, which would, basically identify some of the challenges, like, Vikram suggested some challenges in the American election process. We too also have some challenges. So do you have any plans in future for the same?
So, you know, I looked very briefly, not in any deep way, at the process of the first time electoral rolls were made in African countries that went out of colonial rule. And I think one of my immediate conclusions is that, you know, if you do not prepare an electoral roll as accurate as possible or as humanly possible first time, it's then very difficult to put in place the electoral process. Because this list of voters, when you think about it, this is the plinth upon which rests the institution of electoral democracy. And this is the basis for voters to build trust in the system. And it's only if their name is properly on the list that they can trust it. And I think some failures in some countries had to do with the failure of doing it. If you look at what happened with the franchise in Pakistan, it can teach you something about the failure of democracy there. In Pakistan, for example, the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan and then the government couldn't decide for years what would be the form of franchise. They had this weird system initially of separate electorates for Western Pakistan, joint electorate for Eastern Pakistan, and ultimately, you know, if you don't decide what is the structure of the franchise, you cannot make electoral rolls. So they couldn't even make electoral rolls. So how can you put in place, if you can't put in place electoral rolls, how can you put in place the process? So I looked at it a little bit from that perspective, also from the perspective more currently, not historically, through experiences of election management bodies, election commissioners across the Commonwealth. And you should know that the Election Commission of India is a role model for many states in Africa. The first Chief Election Commissioner of India, Sukumar Sen, who in fact, he's appointed in March 1950. So it's until Sukumar. Exactly. So he, after he's doing the first elections in India in 1951-52, he goes to help to do the elections in Sudan in 1953-4. And still today, many African countries are learning from the Election Commission of India.
You know, one of the problems, I'll just finish this thing. One of the problems is I think we tend to be so focused on the US and the UK in terms of looking at examples and histories that we forget about all the other processes which the people in this book were very aware of. I mean, they learned across. I mean, as I said, we got the idea of the Election Commission from Canada. And Canada very clearly was designing an election process in opposition to the chaos that they saw in the United States. Australia is another country which has been at the forefront of electoral innovations. I think we get the first idea of a secret ballot comes from Australia. And maybe I'm wrong, but yeah. But I mean, again, the Australian, the Australian state has innovated with elections in terms of proportional representation, in terms of new ways of trying to find a result. So we need to look at all these histories. We need to look at the influence of the Indian elections in other countries, as you said. You know, we have to break. We have one last question from the gentleman front.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Considering that you're from Israel, would you share with us a little bit about the Israeli experience? The very fact that you had people who were living there, you had the Palestinians who were living in Palestine, and then you had the influx of the Jewish population coming in from different parts of Europe and Africa and elsewhere. How were the electoral rolls prepared there?
Okay. So, you know, I didn't mention it in relation to your comparative question, but another place I looked at was how they prepared the first rolls in Israel in the context of partition. But realizing very quickly that, let's talk about the scale. So to do the electoral roll in Israel in 1949, they declared 7 hours of curfew, and during 7 hours, they enrolled the whole country, right? It's such a small place, so the scale is just uncomparable. And I looked at the question of what did they do with the Arab population who became citizens of Israel. So there were huge efforts to register them on the roll, perhaps it came from the wrong place. In fact, by making them citizens and then not having, you know, claims on property, etc. later. But you know, they took 7 hours to do the draft electoral rolls in India. You needed, you know, almost 2 years to do the draft rolls, and of course the conditions were quite different in terms of the scale. They had to enroll, 500,000 people? So the scale, very different.
Thank you so much. As I said, like, you know, at every Lit Fest, you know, we have these books and we tell you, but this is one book I would say everyone really needs to read, because if we do not appreciate our electoral process, we stand to lose it. And I think, Ornit, we owe you a big debt for having uncovered this history. Thank you very much.